William Walker Atkinson's The New Psychology, Its Message, Principles, and Practice. Chapter 11 was Emotion. This is Chapter 12, Imagination. The new psychology regards the faculty of imagination in its creative aspect with a degree of consideration foreign to the older view. The latter regarded the imagination in its negative phase of fancy and idle daydreaming rather than in its positive phase of creative activity. While it is true that the imagination is more frequently employed by the average person in its negative phase than in its positive phase, in its aspect of fanciful, unreal imagining or imaging, rather than in its aspect of seeing ahead, planning, creating, and forecasting, this does not lessen the importance of the faculty, the fault being with the person so using it. It has been quite the fashion among so-called practical people to speak slightingly of the faculty of the imagination as representing all that was impractical, unreal, fanciful, having no basis in actuality. Imagination was confounded with imaginary. These people overlooked or ignored the fact that all inventive and creative work of the mind is performed by this faculty. The use of the terms imaginative, imaginary, etc. shows how firmly fixed in the public mind is this half view of the wonderful faculty of the imagination, one of the most important in the mind of man. It is one of the distinctive features of the new psychology that it gives to imagination its proper place in the list of the positive faculties of the mind, and urges the scientific control and development of the faculty. The misconception regarding the imagination arises from the fact that it is most commonly seen in its negative phase, involuntary imagination or daydreaming. This involuntary use of the imagination, without purpose or control, amounts to but little more than idle dreaming, and the term daydreaming is well applied to it. In this use of the faculty, misuse would be the better term. The subconscious is allowed to unfold into the field of consciousness some of its wonderful stores, following a first thought along the lines of association and allowing an idle grouping of mental images, without the design or intelligent order, and above all, without purpose or use. This is mere dreaming, and is a habit which obtains quite a hold over people if indulged in, and is very apt to lead them away from the actual activities of life. It is a mild form of mental intoxication, the effects of which are often as disastrous as those of other forms of intoxication. This idle dreaming tends to weaken the will and render infirm the purposive faculties of the mind. The most harmful result of this practice is that it usurps the place rightfully belonging to action. It is so much easier and so much more pleasant to dream of accomplishments than to attempt to make them come true in actual life. The habitual daydreamer gradually loses the desire to participate in the activities of life and slowly sinks into a mere passive existence, doing as little actual work as possible, and always longing for his hours of dream life as the morphine victim longs for his drug or the liquor victim longs for his glass. Excuse me. Professor Halleck has well said of the above tendency, the daydreamer attains eminence at one bound. He is without trouble a victorious general on a vast battlefield, an orator swaying thousands, a millionaire with every amusement at his command, a learned man confounding the wisest, a president, an emperor, a czar. After reveling in these imaginative sweets, the dry bread of actual toil becomes exceedingly distasteful. It is so much easier to live in regions where everything comes at the stroke of a magic wand, the magic wand of fancy. And recognizing this fact, the new psychology sets its face squarely against this negative form of the use of the imagination, and it teaches that it may be overcome by transmuting the energies of the dream into images of things connected with the life work of the individual. character building, self-mastery, and general actual creative work. The positive phase of imagination, in fact. The new psychology holds that the positive use of the imagination along creative or constructive lines is worthy of cultivation and development by scientific methods, for the reason that by its intelligent and purposive application it leads to all progress and advancement, attainment, and realization. Creative and constructive imagination furnishes the pattern, the design, the mold of the future action or material manifestation. The imagination is the architect of deeds, actions, and accomplishments. A well-known woman of this land once made the remark that she prayed for that her sons might be given the active power of creative and constructive imagination. And her wish was a wise one, for from that power are derived the plans of future accomplishment. Sir Benjamin Brodie once said, "Physical investigation, more than anything besides, helps to teach us the actual value and right use of the imagination, of that wondrous faculty which, when left to ramble uncontrolled, leads us astray in a wilderness of perplexities and errors, a land of mists and shadows, but which, properly controlled by experience and reflection, becomes the noblest attribute of man, the source of poetic genius, the instrument of discovery in science, without the aid of which Newton would never have invented fluxions, nor Davy have decomposed the earths and alkalis, nor would Columbus have found another continent." Tyndall, the great English scientist of the last century, said, "We are gifted with the power of imagination, and by this power we can lighten the darkness which surrounds the world of the senses." There are stories, even in science, who regard imagination as a faculty to be feared and avoided rather than employed. They have observed its action in weak vessels and are unduly impressed by its disasters. But they might with equal truth point to exploded boilers as an argument against the use of steam. Bounded and conditioned by cooperant reason, imagination becomes the mightiest instrument of the physical discoverer. Newton's passage from a falling apple to a falling moon was, at the outset, a leap of the imagination. In short, in considering the theory of the creative and constructive work of the imagination, it may be said that it is but another example of that fundamental and basic principle of the new psychology, the principle of the ego using its instruments instead of allowing them to use it. The ego uses its imaginative faculty along creative and constructive lines, instead of allowing the faculty to run away with it in the direction of idle dreaming and fanciful imagining. It is the positive use of the mind instead of the negative. This principle runs through the entire field of the new psychology, and this is but another instance of its application. And now arises the question: how may the imagination be cultivated and directed along creative and constructive lines of activity? The new psychology answers this in numerous ways. Let us take a hasty glance at these answers. Number 1. In the first place, the imagination, or rather the subconscious region of the mind, to which the imagination belongs, should be filled with a variety of well-selected images, selected with the idea of profitable use. The attention should be directed toward and held upon subjects and objects calculated to be useful and profitable to the mind. For from this stock of mental images, stored in the subconscious region, the finished product of the imagination must be formed. And the images should be clear, definite, well impressed. 2. Cultivate the creative and constructive use of the imagination. That is, Acquire the habit of using the imagination in the direction of laying out and planning actual work ahead of you. Get into the way of making definite plans of work and action, and then following out these plans in action. Get into the way of planning things, even little things, instead of merely allowing them to happen. In other words, get into the way of seeing the thing in your mind's eye before you manifest it physically. Try to improve upon present methods and to advance along the lines of your occupation. Not necessarily making changes just for the sake of change, but try to improve, if even but a little, in the accomplishment of the things you do. There is always room for improvement, and so use your imagination in this way. You will find that after the habit is acquired, you will experience considerable pleasure in materializing your mental images, in accomplishing the things you have seen in your mind's eye. 3. Avoid as a pestilence the negative habit of idle daydreaming, for the reasons given a little further back. Let your daydreams be purposive, and always with the idea of making them come true. Keep the idea of planning in your mind as an antidote for the tendency to idly dream. Number 4, in your use of the imagination, in the direction above indicated, always hold to the central purpose of the thought or image. Build up and tear down, alter and change the image as much as you see fit, but always with the idea of improving and completing the original idea. Keep to the main idea and do not allow yourself to be sidetracked. 5. Learn to discard mental images that do not fit in with your plan. A little practice will enable you to brush aside images that do not fit into the plan, instead of allowing them to float in, as is the case with ordinary daydreaming. 6. Subject all your mental images to the test. Will they make me stronger? Will they make me better, more powerful? Are they positive or negative? Reject the negatives and hold fast to the positives. And number 7, use the imagination in the direction of seeing yourself as you wish to be, and cultivate the habit of forming a clear mental picture of things and conditions as you wish them to be. By familiarizing your mind with the conditions you want, you form the proper mental paths to lead to the realization. The imagination is your pattern maker, the die sinker, your mold maker. Make it to do its work properly. For as is the pattern, die, or mold, so will be the materialization. Chapter 13 will be memory.